You're listening to the HR Mixtape, your podcast with the perfect mix of practical advice, thought-provoking interviews, and stories that just hit different so that work doesn't have to feel, well, like work. Now, your host, Shari Simpson.
Joining me today is James Atkinson, Vice President of Thought Leadership for the Society of Human Resource Management. James focuses on identifying emerging trends and issues affecting the modern workforce, particularly emphasizing workplace flexibility and employee well-being. James, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me on the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on the show.
So this topic around working caregivers is really fascinating to me. I have 3 children, as those who have listened to the podcast for a while know. They're all grown now, but there definitely was a time in my own life where I was trying to balance working or not working, daycare or not daycare. And, as I've gotten older, now I'm starting to think about my parents and what they might need. So I know this is a relevant topic. It has been for many years, but what makes it urgent right now as HR leaders think about planning for the future for this population?
Yeah. So first of all, the story you just shared is a story that we hear a lot. In fact, more than 50 million working caregivers are in our current labor force, and that's carrying across different groups. So children, adults with chronic care, as well as the elderly. And so it's impacting so many in the workforce right now. And for organizations, they've got to understand not just that these people are here, but what the needs are, because it's going to have a real impact on productivity. If they're not supported well, it's going to have a real impact on, their ability to kind of do their work well. It's also going to impact whether or not they want to stay with your organization. And retention is a huge issue, obviously, that many HR professionals care about. So there's a lot of reasons why this is a huge topic. It's one of the reasons why we focused in on that in some of our research.
Well, and I'm starting to see even differences in benefits and some of the things that are coming out of HR departments and how we're thinking about flexibility different. I think the pandemic definitely opened our eyes to different types of flexibility for caregivers. And I don't think that's changed, but it's complex. It's hard to make sure that you are meeting your business objectives and productivity and performance measurements and that kind of stuff. So, what are some of the workplace challenges that you've seen? I mentioned a few there, but what are the ones that are rising to the surface that HR is really trying to tackle to still have a workforce that meets their business objectives? Because at the bottom line, right, businesses to make money. And so we need to be cognizant of that as we roll out programs.
Yeah, well, some of the biggest challenges we see from the perspective of the caregivers themselves is, one, they tell us that it really has a negative impact on their career at times, especially if they're not supported well. We found that 42% of working caregivers told us that their caregiving responsibilities have had that kind of negative impact. And we see this in things like that insufficient support, some workplace stigma. We see it in just that unpredictable interruptions to work. You go to work expecting the day to look like something, and then all of a sudden it looks like something else. And you as an individual have to be flexible. And then from an HR perspective, it's really about what can be done to support people, again, so that they can be productive in their jobs. You noted the rise of kind of remote and hybrid work, which we all jumped into, ready or not, about 5 or so years ago. Hard to believe. But with that, what happened is it allowed a lot of organizations to realize that they might be able to do this kind of work. And while we've seen a number of organizations kind of move back into the office, and it's imperative on kind of HR professionals working with their managers to figure out ways that they might still be able to provide some flexibility as needed, even if it's not part of the broader work model that's there.
Yeah. How have you seen in your data that pressure on working caregivers affect things like productivity and engagement and retention?
Well, one thing I will note is that if caregivers are supported well, we don't see a drop off in things like productivity. We don't see differentials in retention or engagement. It's when workers aren't supported that we start to see some of those things. And I'll give you a couple of examples here of what we're seeing. So one is that, 1 in 4 have had to reduce their workload in order to provide those caregiving responsibilities. 1 in 5 have had to kind of just reduce the hours that they're doing as well. In fact, we see that if caregivers aren't supported, they're missing on average 1.2 working days every single month. And for one individual, that may not seem like a lot, but if you take that out across the labor force, we actually see that 1.2 working days per month translate into about $17.5 billion in lost productivity every single month, just from that insufficient support being provided to caregivers.
How is HR tackling this? I think of all the initiatives that we have across all of our inclusive initiatives, right? Caregivers are one group that we have to think about. What are you seeing HR do to provide the type of support that this group needs?
Yeah, well, the best HR functions are first and foremost understanding who the caregivers are and their organizations. I think historically, we've spent a lot of time thinking about caregiving as, the example you started with of, you have children and you have to, figure out how to balance work and caregiving for those kids. And that still is kind of the biggest percentage of caregivers that we see. But we're seeing growing numbers of people caring for adults with chronic conditions, growing numbers of people caring for the elderly. And in fact, we see about 1 in 4 in the survey that we did who are doing multiple caregiving responsibilities at the same time. So it might be a kid and a parent at the same time. We often call that a sandwich generation. And that's when, these types of pressures and challenges are really compounding on themselves. So first and foremost, HR is understanding who that is at their organization and understanding kind of what their needs are and how that might differ across these different groups. I think the second thing is really trying to think about what are the types of benefits that you can provide and making sure that matches with what are the types of benefits that employees actually think will be important. So one of the things is to really understand what caregivers feel is important to them and making sure you're matching those benefits accordingly. So for example, the number one thing that those who are caring for the elderly say would be super important is elder care services and access to those. But only about 7% of organizations provide that type of benefit to their employees. And so there's a bit of a mismatch there in what is needed versus what is provided. So organizations just really have to understand where those gaps are.
Yeah. When I was earlier in my career and we were looking at, some of the big names out there, right? Google, Netflix, right? Some of those big tech companies, it was fascinating to see the ancillary benefits they continue to add to their on-site campuses, like daycare, like laundry service, like, all those different things. I have yet to hear of a company doing elder care on site and what an impact that could potentially have to this population. I'm Gen X, so I'm right in that space where, potentially if my kids were younger, I might have that sandwich scenario that you're talking about. So it really does force the HR organization to think differently about what resources they give people.
Yes, absolutely. And like you said, there's an opportunity to think differently, especially as we see the changes in who we're typically providing care for as well. We have fewer young people and a growing elderly population. And so we need to really get at the forefront of thinking about what that shift looks like in terms of providing support for caregivers.
Yeah, maybe it's not bring your child to work day. Maybe it's bring your parent to work day.
Yes, maybe it is.
That would be so much fun. For some people, I'm sure it might not be fun for everybody. How do HR professionals start to think about leave policies differently? So, we have the government mandated things like FMLA and, ADA and those types of things, but organizations can level those up just like any other policy. What are you seeing in changes happening there from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I think people are just kind of rethinking what's the difference between what you have to do to be legally compliant and what you have to do to be competitive in the marketplace for talent. And those are not the same things. So we see organizations saying, okay, we have to provide you this type of lead, but we're going to provide you this additional type. Or even more so, just an underlying culture of flexibility can go a long way as well. I think the idea that it has to be a kind of strict policy, the best organizations, I think, are saying, you know what, we're going to empower our managers to do the right thing. And we're going to empower them to have conversations and say, oh, you need to be flexible today, then that's great. We'll rearrange your work so that you can get it done at this time in this location. We're still going to hit our deadlines, but you're going to do it in a way that allows you to accommodate what you're doing. And that's not necessarily written as a policy, but there's a culture that you can really implement at your organization of saying, hey, we're going to provide flexibility. And this isn't just for caregivers, this is for all employees. Life happens. And if you have that culture of, okay, we're going to work around that while still delivering the outcomes that we're supposed to be delivering, I think you're going to see in response that loyalty from employees to say, hey, this was a tough situation. I had that flexibility. I was able to do it. So when I don't need that support, I'm going to give that much more. And I'm going to want to stay at that organization.
And that ties into discretionary effort. I feel like we haven't talked about that a lot over the last several years because there's so much change in how we think about the term engagement. And I was just talking about this with somebody else about how Gen Z is coming into the workforce and they have a very different perspective on loyalty to an organization, engagement, and those kinds of things. So we don't talk a lot about discretionary effort, but you hit the nail on the head when you said like, hey, life happens. We're all human, like that narrative of, feeling bad for calling in sick when you have sick time available to you. Like that's wild, but we all have, I know most of the people I know in my life have gone through that exact feeling of, oh, I don't know if I should take this benefit because I don't know how I'm going to be perceived. But it's like, we all have life stuff that happens.
Exactly.
So I love that concept of, how do you create a culture of flexibility that's human?
Yes, exactly. And I think once you have that embedded throughout your organization, then the outcomes are going to come your way, right? You're going to have those employees that are saying, hey, you care about me in the tough times. Like, I'm going to put that extra effort in tomorrow, the next day, the next week, etc., because I know that if another challenging time comes about, you're going to provide that accommodation. And again, I think that, to your point, it puts the human element into all of this. And I think that's really important. And I think the best organizations are figuring out how to do that well.
Yeah. And it removes the kind of the bureaucracy of having to follow a really stringent policy. What do you think is one particular benefit that can get overlooked by HR that if we implemented it, it could really help with this scenario?
So I'm going to repeat what I've said before, in that it may not be a particular benefit that we go out and buy. I think it is a little bit more of a push towards workplace flexibility across the organization. And so if we think about that as a benefit, as opposed to kind of the typical menu of benefits that we do, I actually think that has the ability to do greater impact than a lot of things that we can provide, because organizations are so different. And to say, hey, it's this one particular thing, that really may not make sense for a given organization. But the concept of flexibility, the concept of embedding that in the culture, I'm going to double down on that answer. and just say, I think that is really where we can see some powerful results if we as HR are not just pushing that from our end, but we're certainly supporting and developing our managers and leaders to do that on their teams as well.
What do you say to the leader who's working in manufacturing, who's working in hospitality or retail or restaurant, where, these are hourly frontline workers and you have to have X number of staff on the floor at all times? What does flexibility look like there? Meaning, how do we plan for it, right? You still want to offer it. And the kind of caveat is you don't actually know when you're going to need it. So how do we, as really good strategic partners to our businesses, build that into our talent planning?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because a lot of times we think about, the flexibility of working from home, but you can't work from home if your job requires you to be on site. I think there's a couple of different ways to be thinking about that. One is to make sure that you have a strong contingency workforce, right? So having access to, whether it's a company you work with that can provide temporary workers in a short period of time, I think that certainly is something that you want to have some of that flexibility in your overall workforce to be able to do something similar to that. For kind of a short-term flexibility versus long-term flexibility, I think is also something that you have to think about. And, in the long term, you may have to hire somebody in for a period of time, especially if someone goes out on a leave that, is something like FMLA. But in the short term, to the extent that you can provide a little bit of that kind of ebb and flow in your workforce, I think that's one of the key areas to make sure you have, on hand to be able to provide that flexibility.
And what a cool way to think about gig economy, right? And gig roles. If you can think about creating those gig opportunities for maybe somebody who works in a different restaurant, but they have all the skills you need, right? Going back to like a more skills-based way of looking at things. That is revolutionary if you think about really getting into that kind of mindset of leveraging a gig economy that way. It had a huge impact.
And, they have the skills that you need and may not have the hours that they want, right? And so all of a sudden you're kind of providing them with more work opportunities, and you're filling that gap that you need in order to support one of your employees who's might hit a challenge.
Yeah. As we wrap up our conversation, James, and you kind of look ahead at the future, and I've asked this question before to a couple of people around 5 years from now. Sometimes 5 years is really far away, as we know the pandemic has taught us. But, how do you see some of these evolving demographics really changing the future of work with respect to caregiving? Because we know that the boomer generation is nearing retirement. Not everybody's going to retire at obviously 65, but that's changing. And so you have the complexities of knowledge transfer and all the other things. But then you add in now this population of caregivers. How do you see it changing in the future?
Yeah, well, we actually did ask a question to those who took this particular survey that was a part of our caregiving research. And we found that 1 in 5 current caregivers are expecting to take on new or additional caregiver responsibilities for the elderly population in the next 5 years. And about 13%, or say 1 in 8, who are not currently providing caregiving of any sort, are expecting in the next 5 years to be providing care for someone in the elderly population. So it's not surprising. We know that across the next few years, I think by about 2030, roughly 1 in 5 adults will be 60 or older. And so that's the direction that we as organizations need to be thinking about. What does caregiving for the elderly look like in terms of the support we can provide for our employees while continuing to provide what we do for other groups? That's the one that if we don't pay attention to that in the next few years, we're going to be very unprepared to support those caregivers in our workforce.
Yeah. Well, James, this was a great conversation, and I'll make sure to put in the show notes a link to the research that Sherm has done on this topic because it's so important. And I just appreciate you taking a few minutes of your day to talk with me.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can find show notes and links at thehrmixtape.com. Come back often and please subscribe, rate, and review.